They gave me a folding chair. Not a seat, not a delegate station with a name plaque and a console and a direct feed to the chamber's translation network. A folding chair, the kind assembled in a gymnasium when regular seating runs out, positioned at the far edge of the orrery chamber's outer gallery, where the light barely reached, and the translation feed arrived with a half-second delay that made every alien statement feel like it was coming from somewhere slightly outside the present moment. 3 years I had been sitting in that chair. Earth's liaison to the Galactic Council. It was a title that sounded significant at embassy functions back home and meant precisely nothing in the six-tiered chamber, where 17 species arranged themselves by political weight, and Earth sat at the outermost edge with a folding chair and an earpiece that didn't quite fit right. I adjusted the earpiece. It didn't need adjusting. Councillor Vrethsa was already speaking. His voice moved like slow water over stone, calm on the surface, carrying everything downstream without appearing to try. He was the oldest active member of the High Chamber, senior delegate of the Keth Combine, and he had occupied his seat on the council for longer than humanity had known other species existed. When he spoke in the lower register, the measured formal cadence he saved for votes, it meant the decision had already been made in private sessions, and today's proceedings were theater. I had known this particular vote was coming for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of sitting with that information, eating station food that tasted like processed cardboard, pretending to file routine reports while I figured out what, if anything, could be done. The charge: destabilizing influence on pre-integration species. The specific incident: Earth's presence in the Keth Belt, where our contact teams had been working alongside the Orath for 4 years. 4 years of agricultural development, water reclamation infrastructure, medical supply lines, communications upgrades. 3 music schools built from prefabricated materials and an extraordinary amount of community volunteer labor. 1 football pitch, constructed by a contact team engineer named Owen Clark, who had apparently considered it a professional obligation, that had become the most contested piece of ground in the belt for reasons entirely unrelated to politics. The Galactic Council called it cultural contamination. I had a different word for it, but I was a guest in their chamber, and I had been raised with some degree of professional restraint. The Orath, Vrethsa said, in that slow-water voice, were on a natural integration trajectory fully consistent with Accord projections. Earth's unsanctioned presence in the belt has accelerated contact timelines in ways that compromise that trajectory and destabilize the developmental baseline the Council has carefully maintained across 3 integration cycles. Natural integration trajectory. I had read the Council's file on the Orath. Not because anyone gave it to me, they did not give Earth files on anything, but because I had submitted a public records request under Article 14 of the Accord, which permitted any registered diplomatic observer to access non-classified integration documentation. The clerk who processed my request had looked at me the way people look at someone who has just done something technically legal but socially baffling. I smiled at her, she processed it. The natural integration trajectory for the Orath looked, in the documents, remarkably similar to what it looked like for every other species the Council had flagged as pre-integration. A period of careful observation followed by gradual resource partnership discussions, timed specifically to begin when the species had developed enough to sign agreements, but not enough to understand what those agreements would mean over the long term. 3 integration cycles was approximately 90 years. The Orath had been on that trajectory for 62 of them. They had been waiting for someone to help them build a water reclamation network for 30 of those years. Earth's team completed 1 in 14 months. That was, apparently, the problem. Under Article 7, Clause 9 of the Accord of Interstellar Stability, Vrethsa continued, his voice never varying in pace or weight, the Council moves to sanction Earth through economic blockade, technology embargo, and diplomatic isolation, effective 30 standard cycles from this date. All non-commercial Earth presence is to be withdrawn from 14 designated systems. Earth will submit to quarterly external audits of all extrasolar activity for a period of no less than 6 cycles. The chamber held a very specific kind of quiet after that. Not respectful, not shocked. Expectant. 17 species on 6 tiers, arranged in the precise geometric pattern that had governed Galactic Council sessions for 300 years, all leaning forward in whatever anatomical configuration their biology allowed, waiting for the human response, waiting for raised voices, demands for review, threats of counteraction. At the floor level, below the gallery, I watched Director General Kofi Mensah stand. He was a large man. He had run Earth's 3rd Contact Corps before moving into diplomacy, and still carried himself with the particular stillness of someone who had spent years in situations where moving the wrong way had real consequences. He had gray at his temples and a quality of attention in his face that made you feel, when he looked at you, that he had already considered every version of this conversation and was simply waiting for you to catch up. He stood for 2 full seconds without speaking. Every species in that chamber waited. Mensah said, "We will need that in writing." Then he sat back down. 6 words. The chamber did not know what to do with 6 words. I watched Vrethsaw's secondary eyes, the pair that sat slightly above his primary set, the ones he could not fully control the way he controlled his features, move once toward the Earth delegation and then carefully, deliberately away. The written decree will be filed with all registered diplomatic parties within 1 standard cycle, he said. There was a pause of exactly 2 seconds before he said it. That pause was its own kind of answer. "Thank you," Mensah said without looking up. I adjusted my earpiece. The session closed. The gallery emptied in the organized shuffle of 17 species. I moved with them, still catching stray transmissions from nearby conversation. 2 Drain observers walked directly ahead of me. They were speaking low Drain, the casual register, not the diplomatic form, and they clearly had no awareness that I had spent 8 months learning it 2 years ago out of sheer stubbornness and a very bad sleep schedule. One said, "What does this mean? Is that acceptance?" The 6 words. The other said, "I do not know. I have never understood what humans mean by what they do not say." I stepped into the corridor. A hand touched my elbow. Vel. He was a Veth attaché, one of the small number still permitted into public sessions after the reclassification. He had been on the station longer than I had. He had been in this same gallery 8 years ago when the council voted to reclassify the Veth Compact, a living civilization of 42 million people, as a non-voting resource territory. 11 votes, a procedural footnote, 20 minutes of session time. I had been 26 years old, sitting in my first week in the folding chair, and I had watched it happen and done nothing because I had not yet learned the architecture of the thing I was sitting inside. Vel did not say anything now. He looked at me for a moment. His face held something I did not have the vocabulary to name, but understood completely. I did not say anything either. He let go of my elbow and walked toward the east corridor. I stood alone in the gallery hallway for 30 seconds. 30 cycles. 30 standard months before the blockade closed in. Before 14 systems went dark to Earth's teams. Before the quarterly audits turned every piece of Earth's off-world work into something that needed council approval to breathe. I thought about 30 years of the Oreth waiting for water. I thought about Vel's face 8 years ago, the way he had sat very still and looked at the floor for a long time after the vote. I thought about 300 years of council records sitting in the public archive, accessible under Article 14 to any registered observer, formatted in 6 administrative languages, and never, in 3 centuries, fully read by anyone who might do something with them. Right, I thought. Sure. Okay. I walked to my quarters, sat down at my desk and started making a list. Personal leave, the filing said. I had 32 days of accumulated personal leave, and I used all of them. The station's travel coordinator, a young man named Cal Briggs who processed departure requests with the expression of someone doing a job that confused him slightly, looked at my itinerary for a long moment. These are not standard diplomatic destinations, he said. No, I said. Some of these are not on the approved visitor registry. I am aware. I submitted an access variance under Article 14, Section 3. You should have the confirmation code. He checked his screen. He did. I had filed it 4 days before the sanction vote, which was technically before I officially knew about the sanction vote, but nobody in the travel office was going to check the timestamps carefully enough to notice. Safe travels, Cal said, with the tone of someone deciding not to ask further questions. I took 7 species visits in 22 days. Not diplomatic visits, not registered contact meetings with filed agendas and official records. I was on personal leave. I was traveling. If I happened to sit with community councils and listen to people talk for hours at a time and take notes in a paper notebook I had bought from a station gift shop, that was simply what I chose to do with my free time. Nobody could object to a person listening. The first stop was the Drain settlement on Keth 4, a low-orbit mining colony that had been in resource partnership with the council for 70 years. I had read about the Drain in the public files. Reading about them and being there were 2 entirely different experiences. The settlement existed at the edge of what the atmospheric processors could maintain. The air tasted like metal and something else I could not name. The structures were functional in the specific way that things are functional when nobody with resources cares whether they are comfortable. Children played in corridors between equipment bays. The lighting was entirely artificial because the colony's surface-level solar allocation had been redirected to the processing facilities under the terms of the resource partnership. That was in the contract, subsection 14. I had read it. The community council met with me in a room that held 7 elders and exactly 8 chairs. They gave me a chair. I told them I was there to listen. One of the elders, a woman named Ruth, looked at me for a long moment before she said anything. She had the particular quality of stillness that comes not from calm, but from long experience with how much motion costs. Humans always say they are listening, she said. Then they hear something and they go away and do something about something else. That is a reasonable concern, I said. Why is it different now? I thought about Vel's face in the corridor. I thought about a 30-cycle countdown that had started 3 days ago. Because now there is a deadline, I said. She looked at me. All right, she said, then listen. They talked for 6 hours. I filled 11 pages of the notebook. The Drain had filed 340 petitions with the Galactic Council over the past 80 years, requests for atmospheric processor upgrades, contract renegotiations, safety inspections, a review of the solar allocation clause that had been written before anyone fully understood what it meant in practice. Response rate 0. Not delayed responses, not responses under review, 0. The petitions existed in the public record because the council's filing system was automatic and thorough. They were logged, time-stamped, and assigned case numbers. They simply had never generated a single reply. I wrote down every case number. The elder who walked me out, a man whose name the translation earpiece rendered as something close to Warren, said, "What will you do?" I said, "I am going to read more." He did not look satisfied with that answer. I could not blame him. I did not stay long enough to explain the rest. The second stop was the Solvari remnant, 3 stations and a drifting habitat cluster, all that remained of a civilization of 11 million people, following what the Council's official records called a natural integration event in the category of internal conflict. The internal conflict had been between two Solvari factions who disagreed about whether to accept the Council's resource partnership proposal. The Council had, according to 6 separate documents I had found in 3 different archive sections, provided communication equipment and logistical support to one of those factions. Those documents were not filed together. They were not cross-referenced. They sat in 3 different archive sections under different administrative categories. I had found them by reading everything. I spent 2 days with the Solvari Remnants Coordinating Council. A woman named Nadia Cross ran it, young for the weight she was carrying, with the kind of precise and careful speech that comes from spending years making sure every word could survive being examined later. She told me things that were not in any document. I wrote them down. When I left, she followed me to the transit bay. "The drain sent a message," she said. "They said a human came and listened without recording, without official devices." "That is correct," I said. "Why no recording?" "Because I am on personal leave," I said. "Nothing official is happening." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "The Orath want to speak with you. They asked us to tell you if we saw you." I told her I was planning to visit them next. She nodded. Then she said something I carried with me for the rest of the trip. "We have been filing petitions for 40 years. Nobody reads petitions, but everyone hears noise, be very loud." The Orath were, as I had suspected from 4 years of contact reports, entirely remarkable people. They were also, at the precise moment of my visit, furious on Earth's behalf in a way that was both deeply moving and logistically inconvenient for my quiet personal leave framing. Leon Price from our contact team met me at the transit dock. He had been on Orath Prime for 2 years and had gone native in every positive sense of that phrase. He had learned the language, adopted 6 local customs, and was wearing a woven band on his wrist that I recognized as an Orath mark of community membership. "They want to file a counterpetition," he told me before I had fully disembarked. "The Community Council sat for 9 hours last week. They want to go on record that Earth's presence was invited, welcomed, and beneficial, and that the Council's characterization is inaccurate." "That is their right under Article 14, I said. "I know," I told them. "They want to know if it will do anything." I stopped walking. "Tell them to file it," I said, "and tell them to file it in full with every specific detail they want included. Tell them not to summarize. Tell them to write everything." Leon looked at me with an expression somewhere between confused and cautiously hopeful. "What are you planning?" "I am on personal leave," I said. "I am not planning anything." His expression said he did not believe me. I spent 3 days with the Orath Community Council. They were generous with their time, their food, which was extraordinary, and their fury, which was precise and articulate and very well documented. I wrote everything down in the margins of my notebook because I had run out of pages by day 4 of the trip. By day 18, I had visited 7 species. My notebook was full. I had 3 external data drives loaded with case numbers, petition timestamps, contract cross-references, and notes that made no sense out of context but contained, in aggregate, a picture that was very clear once you knew what you were looking at. The picture was this. The Galactic Council had spent 300 years building, very carefully, a system that looked like cooperation and functioned like something else entirely. It worked because the pieces were spread across so many archives, in so many languages over so many cycles, that nobody had ever assembled them in one place. I had assembled them. I was sitting in my temporary accommodation on Drain Transit Hub, surrounded by 3 data drives and a notebook filled margin to margin in my own handwriting, when I understood that I was not angry. Anger was the wrong register for what I was carrying. Anger was hot and unfocused and spent itself fast. What I was holding was colder and much more useful. I had a deadline, 30 cycles minus 22 days. I called Mensa on a secured personal channel. "How was your trip?" he asked. "Educational," I said. "Learn anything interesting?" I learned that the Council's entire administrative record is publicly accessible under Article 14. There was a pause. "I know that," he said carefully. "I learned that nobody has ever read all of it." A longer pause. "How much of it have you read?" "Enough," I said. "Kofi, I need to tell you what I found." I talked for 45 minutes. He did not interrupt. When I finished, the line was quiet long enough that I checked twice to make sure the connection had not dropped. Then Mensa said, "Sweet holy." "Yeah," I said, "I know." "How long to build what you're describing?" I had already done the math. 27 cycles, I said, if we start in the next 10 days. Another pause. "Start," he said. The Council, when Earth announced the formation of the Orath Relief and Petition Assistance Network, sent a formal query asking for clarification of its purpose. Mensa's office responded within one standard cycle. The network, the response explained, was a humanitarian administrative service designed to help qualifying species navigate the Galactic Council's own official petition process. It would provide translation assistance, filing support, and document organization for any species wishing to submit concerns under the Accord's existing frameworks. There was nothing in the Accord that prohibited this. Nothing in Article 7, nothing in Article 14, nothing in the 42 sub-clauses of the Sanction decree that Mensa's legal team had spent 11 days examining with the focused attention of people looking for a gap in a fence. The gap was exactly where I told them it would be. I ran the network out of 3 rooms on a mid-level transit station with a team of 8. A man named Simon Dare handled translation and document formatting. A woman named Ada Whitmore ran the filing coordination and had an instinct for bureaucratic architecture that made me feel, on multiple occasions, like I had been previously doing my job with one hand behind my back. Owen Clark, the same Owen who had built the football pitch on Orath Prime, managed the communication relays. And Vel had officially resigned from his attaché position when the Council requested all VETH personnel submit to a review of their external communications. He had done it quietly, on a Tuesday, without announcement. He had shown up at my transit station door the following morning with a data case and no explanation required. I put him in charge of the archive cross-referencing. He did not smile at that. Vel was not a person who smiled easily, but he sat down at the workstation I showed him and he started working, and something about the way he carried himself in that room was different from the careful stillness he wore everywhere else. He looked, for the first time in all the years I had known him, like he was exactly where he intended to be. The first batch of petitions, 87 filings, submitted in proper Council format in the correct administrative language, with accurate case cross-references, representing 11 species. The Council's standard processing time for petitions under Article 14 was 45 days. 45 days passed. No responses. We published the non-response. Not loudly, no press statements, no official announcements. We simply updated the public-facing record of the network's filings with timestamps showing submission date and current response status, which was pending. Pending, it turned out, is a very loud word when placed next to 87 case numbers and 46 days of silence. The second batch went out 3 weeks later, 162 filings. By now the word had moved through the channels I had spent 22 days of personal leave opening. Species I had not visited were submitting their own documentation through contacts in species I had visited. The Orath, as promised, had filed theirs in full, a 40-page formal statement that cited 12 specific Accord provisions and was, by any legal standard, impeccable. Leon Price had helped them draft it over 2 weeks. I added it to the network's public filing record with particular satisfaction. The council sent a second formal query. This time it came directly from Vrethsaw's administrative office. The language was careful, the kind of careful that means something is not being said, but the message was clear. The council was concerned that the network's activities constituted indirect diplomatic engagement, which fell within the scope of the sanction. I wrote the response myself. The network provided administrative assistance to species exercising rights guaranteed under the Accord. It did not conduct diplomatic negotiations. It did not represent Earth's interests in any council matter. It helped people fill out forms. This was not prohibited by any clause of the sanction decree. I included the specific clause numbers in order. I sent it and felt something uncurl slightly in my chest. This was what I knew how to do, not confrontation but documentation, not argument but record. Give me a form and a case number and enough time, and I will build you something that cannot be argued with because it is built from the opponent's own words. 3 weeks after the second query, Vrethsaw requested a meeting. I went. I brought Ada because Ada's memory for procedural citation was something that ought to be classified as a tactical asset, and because having someone else in the room changes the way a conversation can be shaped. Vrethsaw had a private meeting room that was several visible grades above anything Earth's delegation had ever been offered. The kind of room that communicates, through the quality of its materials and the precision of its atmospheric calibration, exactly how much more seriously some parties are taken than others. He looked when I entered the way I had seen him look in the chamber during particularly delicate votes, not concerned, assessing. "Delegate Osai," he said, which was the first time in 3 years he had used my title rather than my species designation. "Counselor," I said. I sat down. Ada sat beside me and opened her document case without being asked. "The Petition Network," he said. "The Orath Relief and Petition Assistance Network," I said. "Yes. It has processed 312 filings in the past 8 weeks. 319 as of this morning," Ada said, not looking up. Vrethsaw's secondary eyes moved briefly toward her. She continued reviewing her documents. "Many of these filings represent concerns that the Council considers closed matters," Vrethsaw said. "Some represent species classifications that were finalized through proper channels decades ago." "Proper channels," I said, "that required responses to petitions filed under Article 14. I paused. The response rate to those original petitions was, historically, quite low. Administrative capacity has constraints. The response rate was 0, I said. Not loudly, not aggressively, the way you state a measurement. The room held the number for a moment. "Earth is using this network," Vrethsaw said, "to destabilize the Council's administrative authority." "Earth is providing a filing service," I said. "If the Council's administrative authority is destabilized by species submitting properly formatted petitions through existing legal frameworks, that seems like a problem with the administrative authority rather than with the petitions." His primary eyes held mine. I looked back. I had sat in a folding chair for 3 years. I had learned to read 6 administrative languages. I had spent 22 days listening to people whose petitions went nowhere tell me about 30, 40, 60 years of waiting. I had filled a notebook to the margins. I was not going to look away first. "The sanctions will be extended," Vrethsaw said, "and tightened." "That is the Council's right under the Accord," I said. "We will need the new terms in writing." Ada already had a receipt template open. That evening, a message came through the network's secure channel, not from a species contact. From the Council's mid-tier administrative staff, the people who processed filings and formatted decrees and had, for 300 years, been the invisible machinery of an institution too large to see itself clearly. The message contained a list of 47 case numbers. No text, just numbers. I ran the numbers against the archive. 47 petitions from species currently under resource partnership agreements that had been received, logged, assigned case numbers, and then marked with a council internal status code I had not seen before. I looked up the code in the administrative index. The code meant do not process, hold indefinitely. 47 petitions, spanning 60 years. I sat with that information for a long time. Then a second message arrived from the same anonymous source. One document, a private session transcript from 11 years ago, a discussion between 4 senior counselors about whether to reclassify the VETH Compact. The discussion had taken place 1 week before the public vote. The transcript documented, in the council's own words, the agreement to reclassify the VETH not because of any legal finding under the accord, but because a resource extraction license in VETH-controlled space was, as one counselor put it, commercially preferable to an active diplomatic relationship requiring sustained consultation. I read the transcript twice. I thought about Vel, sitting in a detention cell for 11 hours on a technicality 3 weeks ago, released with a formal administrative error apology, who had told me to let it go, who was, at this exact moment, 3 rooms down the corridor, cross-referencing archive files with the systematic focus of someone who had been waiting 8 years to do exactly this. I filed the feeling somewhere specific, not somewhere soft and manageable. Somewhere with edges. I opened my desk drawer and took out the notebook. I had bought a second one by this point. The first was full, but I kept the original in the drawer because of the child's drawing tucked into the back cover. A terrible drawing, done by a drained child on Keth 4 who had handed it to me when I was leaving. A horse, maybe, or a ship, possibly a flower. I had no idea what it was. I had been carrying it for 6 weeks. I tacked it to the wall above my terminal and got back to work. The decision was not made dramatically. There was no moment in a dark room with rain on the window and a single lamp, and a long period of staring into the middle distance. It was not like that. It was me, at 2:30 station time, sitting in front of a compiled data archive that represented 4 months of work, eating a piece of bread because I had not eaten properly in 2 days, reading a message from Ada that said we have everything, and writing back, I think we do too. That was the decision. The archive contained everything. 300 years of Galactic Council administrative records, pulled from the public record under Article 14 over 4 months by a team of 8 people, and 1 borrowed archive processor running continuous search protocols. Every suppressed petition with its timestamp and case number. Every species reclassification cross-referenced against its subsequent resource extraction agreements. Every vote record on every protective mandate that had preceded a territorial integration. The VETH transcript. 47 petitions with the hold indefinitely status code. And more, much more. The further you went into the archive, the more the picture clarified. A system built piece by piece over centuries to look, from any individual angle like governance, but from the assembled view like something considerably different. Nothing was fabricated. Nothing required interpretation. The council had documented everything itself. It simply had never imagined that anyone would bother to read it all. We spent 2 weeks on format and accessibility. Simon worked on the translation layer, 47 languages, all major species dialects, searchable. Ada designed the organizational structure so that a reader from any species could navigate it without needing prior knowledge of council administration. Owen built the transmission architecture to push the package simultaneously to as many unaffiliated relay stations as possible before any blocking response could be coordinated. I wrote the accompanying document myself, not an argument, not an accusation, a finding, 2 pages, every statement sourced to its case number, every case number verifiable in the Council's own public archive. I called it the public record, a complete reference. We picked the transmission time together, the 5 of us in the main room of the 3-room network office at 500 on a Wednesday, which was not a symbolically chosen day. It was simply when we were ready. I looked at the others. Vel was standing at the far terminal, not looking at me. He was looking at the screen that showed the transmission queue loaded and waiting. Ada had her hands folded on the desk in front of her, in the manner of someone who has prepared very thoroughly, and is now in the phase that comes after preparation. Simon was holding a cup of coffee. He had not drunk any of it. Owen was looking at me. "Ready," Owen said. I looked at the wall above my terminal. The child's terrible drawing. 3 months on that wall, and I still could not identify with certainty what it depicted. I thought about what Nadia Cross had said in the transit bay of the Solvari remnant habitat. Everyone hears noise, be very loud. I thought about a clerk in the Council's archive office looking at my Article 14 request with mild bafflement and processing it anyway. I thought about Vel at 23 years old, sitting in the gallery of the orrery chamber, watching 11 hands go up. I thought about 30 years of a species waiting for water and earth building a system in 14 months, and the Council calling it contamination. I hit transmit. The package went to 1,400 relay stations simultaneously. Not all of them would carry it. Some were under direct Council signal management and would block or delay it within minutes. But 1,400 relays, and even a fraction of them staying active long enough to seed the signal into the broader network, meant the package would be out before any coordinated response could contain it. Owen had modeled it 4 different ways. All 4 models said the same thing. Once it was out, it was out. I picked up the coffee I had been holding, drank it. Cold. It had been cold for an hour. It tasted like the floor of a gymnasium, which is what station coffee always tastes like at 500 on any given Wednesday. It was the best thing I had ever tasted. "All right," I said. Ada started the monitoring feed. Relay status began coming in. Green for active, amber for delayed, red for blocked. The board lit up. A lot of red near the core Council systems. But the outer ring, the unaffiliated relays, the ones orbiting species too small for the Council to bother managing directly. Green, 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 green. Owen exhaled. "It is seeded," he said, "past containment threshold." "How far past?" I said. "Very," he said. I sat down. The response came in 3 waves. The first was fast. Within 90 minutes, Council enforcement had blocked 17 relay stations and issued a formal containment order. A message arrived from Vrethzaw's office, flagged urgent and formal protest, and several other capital letter designations that suggested the person who wrote it was operating on very little sleep and a significant amount of institutional alarm. I noted the message's arrival time, did not open it yet. The second wave came from the outer systems, not the Council but the species. Automated acknowledgement confirmations began flowing into the network's incoming queue as the package reached its distribution points. Then actual messages. The Oreth Community Council, in a group message of 47 members, expressing in enthusiastic and somewhat chaotic terms their full support, and something that took 3 translation passes to understand, was essentially, "We told you we wanted to be loud." Leon Price sent a separate message that said only, "Outstanding." The third wave took 6 hours. It came from inside the Council. Not Vrethzaw, not the senior chamber. The middle tier, the administrative staff, the minor delegates, the attached observers from the 17-member species who had been receiving, logging, and processing petitions for years, and in some cases for their entire professional careers. 3 junior delegates from the FEL Cooperative submitted a formal request for independent status review, citing 3 specific documents from the archive package as grounds. They filed it through the network, through our petition process, properly formatted, fully cited, exactly as Ada had designed the system to enable. We processed it within 2 hours. It went into the council's queue with a valid case number. I opened Vrethsaw's message. It was long. The pity was gone from the language, that careful managed sadness he had carried in his voice since the day of the Sanction vote, the tone of someone who has already decided you are a managed problem and is simply waiting for the management to complete. That was gone entirely. Something else was in its place. I knew that register. I had grown up around institutions. My mother had worked in international governance for 30 years, and I had spent my childhood in the waiting rooms and corridors and overflow conference spaces of places that held authority and protected it. I knew every tone those places produced. What was in Vrethsaw's message now was the tone of an institution that had just understood that the thing it had decided was manageable was not manageable. He called the archive release a violation of the sanction. He called it an act of deliberate destabilization. He said Earth had crossed a threshold that could not be uncrossed. He was right about the last part. I wrote the response, short, half a page. The archive contained exclusively public record, accessible under Article 14 to any registered observer. No classified material had been disclosed. No diplomatic engagements had been conducted. Earth had compiled, formatted, and distributed the Council's own administrative record. If the Council wished to pursue a violation claim, it would need to argue, in a public proceeding, that making its own records more accessible to its member species constituted misconduct. I wished him a good standard cycle and sent it. Simon read it over my shoulder. He made a small sound. "Is that the right tone?" he asked. "What tone?" I said. "Exactly," he said. By the end of the first day, 412 relay stations had carried the package, and it had been accessed from at least 37 species-connected systems. The Council's blocking efforts had pulled 17 relays dark, the fastest enforcement action the Council had taken on a communications issue in recorded history, which was itself, Ada pointed out with the mild expression she wore when something was technically satisfying, now part of the public record. By the end of the third day, the FEL Cooperative's request had been joined by 2 others. By the end of the week, the Council had received 900 new petitions through the network's filing system, all properly formatted, all citing the archive package documentation, all demanding responses under Article 14's 45-day processing requirement. Vrethsaw sent one more message on day 4. 7 words. "What do you want from all this?" I read it 3 times. I thought about it carefully. Then I wrote back, 45-day response times. That is what the Accord requires. That is all we are asking for. I sent it. I did not wait for a reply. I had work to do. The network's queue was running 300 new filings, and Ada needed a second document processor, and Owen had found 6 more unaffiliated relay stations willing to host a mirror of the archive. Vel came in at some point that afternoon with 2 cups of station coffee. He set one on my desk. He did not say anything. I picked it up, cold already. Vel had a habit of letting coffee go cold, which I had always considered a personal failing and now understood was simply a matter of priorities. "Thank you," I said. He nodded once, sat down at his workstation, got back to work. 18 months. That was how long it took for the shape of the new thing to become visible. Not complete, it was nowhere close to complete, but visible. The way a building under construction reaches a point where you can see what it will be even through the scaffolding. It was not clean. Anyone who tells you institutional change is clean is selling something, and you should check what is in your wallet before you buy it. The council did not fold gracefully. It did not hold a session, review the evidence, and implement a sweeping reform package. It argued. It delayed. It issued procedural holds on petitions that had procedural holds issued on them in return. It lost 3 internal votes in 6 months, which had never happened in the council's recorded history, and responded to each loss with a new subcommittee. Vretsa survived it all. That surprised me initially. Then it did not. He had been navigating institutional turbulence for longer than I had been alive, and whatever else was true about him, he was not someone who miscalculated the durability of his own position. The first real shift, the one that made me understand the direction of the whole thing, came at week 9, when the council's administrative review board, under pressure from the FEL Cooperative and 4 other member species who had submitted independent status requests, agreed to convene an external review commission. Not a council commission, external, independent authority. The vote was 9-8, the closest the council had taken on anything structural in 40 years. Mensa called me when the result came in. 9-8, he said. 9-8, I said. How are you feeling? I thought about that. Like 9 is enough, I said, for now. The commission needed a chair. That process took 6 weeks and 4 rejected candidates, and 1 absolute standoff that I spent 3 days helping navigate from a distance, before both sides agreed that the standoff needed a person neither side had proposed. That person was Vel. I heard about it in a corridor. Literally in a corridor. I was walking between the network office and the translation bay, holding a data drive in one hand and a folder in the other, when Ada fell into step beside me and said, as if reporting routine filing news, "Vel got the chair appointment." I stopped walking. "The commission chair," I said. "Yes, announced 8 minutes ago." I stood in the corridor for a moment. The data drive in my hand felt very present. The folder felt very present. The fluorescent lighting of the transit station corridor felt very specific and real. Aveth National, chairing an independent review commission with binding authority over the Galactic Council's classification procedures. 8 years after the Council had voted to reclassify the Veth Compact as a non-voting resource territory. 11 votes, a procedural footnote. I sat down on the floor of the corridor. Ada looked down at me. "Are you all right?" she said. "Yes," I said. "You are sitting on the floor." "I am aware," I said. "Give me a minute." She waited. She was good at waiting. I had worked with Ada for over a year by then and had come to understand that she was the most patient person I had ever known in a professional context, and that her patience was not the soft kind but the precise kind. She gave you exactly the amount of time a thing required, and then she got back to work. After approximately 45 seconds, I stood up. "Okay," I said. "Okay," she said. We kept walking. I did not tell Vel that I had sat on the floor of a transit corridor when I heard the news. Some things are better kept as private information. What I did was find him in the archive room that evening and tell him he was the right person, and I was glad it was him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have conditions for accepting." "What conditions?" "The commission needs full access to the archive package. Not just the public record, the full filing record of the network, including the petition response tracking." "That is already public." "I know. I want it formally entered into the Commission's founding documents as the evidentiary baseline. I want it to be the thing the Commission starts from." I looked at him. 300 years of council records compiled over 4 months by 8 people, and 1 borrowed archive processor, formatted by Simon and Ada, transmitted by Owen, assembled because a clerk had processed an Article 14 request, and handed me a baffled look and not looked too closely at the timestamps. "Done," I said. Also, he said, I want Owen on the commission's technical staff. He will be enormously pleased, I said. Vel nodded. He turned back to his screen. Vel, I said. He looked at me. I should have filed something 8 years ago. I was 26 and I did not know how yet, but I should have tried. I am sorry I did not. He was quiet long enough that I thought he was not going to respond. Then he said, You were 26, you learned. He turned back to his screen. That was that. The commission's first session was 9 months after the archive transmission. By then, the network had processed over 4,000 petitions. The council had responded to roughly 800 of them, still well below the Accord's required rate, still generating tracking entries that showed response times in months rather than the 45 days the charter demanded. But 800 responses where there had previously been 0 was. Ada told me one morning with the particular tone she used for things that were statistically significant, an order of magnitude improvement. I told her I was not satisfied with an order of magnitude. She told me she was not either. We agreed on that and got back to work. The Oreth football team arrived at the station in month 11. The Community Council had formally submitted a cultural exchange petition 4 months prior, which the network had processed and filed, and which the Council had technically approved under the new petition response protocols. The cultural exchange was defined as a 12-day sports and community engagement event. The football team numbered 22 players, a coach, 2 assistant coaches, 3 community liaisons, and approximately 40 additional Oreth community members who had also wanted to come. Leon Price accompanied them as cultural liaison, still wearing the woven band on his wrist, now accompanied by a second one he had apparently earned. The station had not hosted a cultural event of this size in its operating history. Cal Briggs in the Travel Coordination Office processed the arrival documentation with an expression I recognized from our first meeting, the expression of a man deciding not to ask further questions, and waved them through. The match was played in the station's main cargo bay with temporary pitch markings laid by Owen and 3 Oreth volunteers in an enthusiastic 5-hour session. The goals were slightly off standard dimensions, and one of the sidelines had to reroute around a support column. It was the best sporting event I have ever attended. The Oreth won by 3 goals. Leon Price scored one of them, which caused considerable noise. Vrethsa attended. This part I did not expect. He came without announcement, without staff, and took a standing position at the far edge of the cargo bay during the second half. I noticed him 20 minutes before the match ended. He was watching the pitch with an expression I did not have a clean read on, not the pity I had learned to recognize, not the careful assessment from the meeting about the network, something older and less managed. When the match ended and the celebration was at its loudest, I walked across the bay toward him. He looked at me. Delegate Osai, he said. Counselor, I said. We stood next to each other for a moment. On the pitch, an Oreth player was attempting to teach the footwork for a particular move to 3 station crew members who had drifted over from a service shift. The crew members were terrible at it. Everybody involved seemed very happy about this. The Commission's first recommendations will be issued next month, Vrethsa said. I know, I said. Some of them will be difficult for the Council to implement. I expect so, I said. You understand that this process will take a very long time, longer than either of us will be in these positions. I know that too, I said. He was quiet for a moment. On the pitch, one of the crew members had apparently gotten the footwork right because there was a significant amount of celebratory noise from the surrounding group. Why did you do it this way? He said. Which way? The forms, the petitions, the record. You could have made noise of a different kind. You could have made this political in the way these things usually become political. I thought about how to answer that honestly. I thought about the Drain elder named Ruth, who had told me that humans seemed to be in pain, and kept asking questions. I thought about 340 petitions over 80 years, and a response rate of 0. I thought about the way an institution looks at you when it has decided you are a managed problem. Because you cannot argue with your own records, I said. You can argue with accusations. You can argue with interpretations. You can argue with politics. But the council filed the case numbers itself. The council wrote the transcripts. The council assigned the status codes. The only way to dispute any of it was to admit the record was wrong, which would have created a different set of problems for the council. He did not respond immediately. It was very patient, he said at last. It was the only approach that would still be standing in 20 years, I said. Something moved across his face. Not pity. Something I did not have a word for yet, the early stages of a thing I might recognize later once I had more data. "Good night, delegate," he said. "Good night, counselor," I said. He left. I stood in the cargo bay for a while, surrounded by Oreth community members and station crew, and the specific quality of a good time being had by people who had not expected to be having it. Owen appeared at my shoulder. "Interesting conversation," he said. "Interesting enough," I said. "What did he want?" "To understand, I think," I said. "He has been in that chamber for a very long time. Things happening in ways he did not predict are genuinely new information for him." Owen considered that. "Is that good?" "It might be," I said. "We will see." 3 months later, I was offered the seat. Not a folding chair at the outer edge of the gallery. A seat. Permanent. Earth's first permanent delegate position on the council since initial contact. A desk with a name plaque and a direct translation feed, and a chair that did not fold. Mensa called me to tell me personally. "Take it," he said. "I know," I said. "That is not a yes. I need to think about it." He waited. He was good at waiting too, in his particular way. The way of someone who has made very large decisions and understands that large decisions need room. I sat with it for 3 days. On the 3rd day, I walked to the archive room and sat across from Vel, who was reviewing commission documents and eating something that smelled like a Veth home recipe he had been making since I had known him. "They offered me the seat," I said. "I know," he said. "I heard." "What would you do?" He did not look up immediately. He finished the paragraph he was reading. Then he set the document down and looked at me. "I would take it," he said, "because the work does not stop because you change the procedure. The procedure is just what makes the work possible. The work is still the work." "Even from inside," I said. "Especially from inside," he said. "You know what the inside looks like now. You know which walls are structural and which ones are just old habit. That is not a small thing to know." I took the seat. The first session under the new chair structure, after the commission issued its initial recommendations, and the council voted to implement 2 of them, which was a smaller number than I wanted and a larger number than I had expected, was quiet, procedural, agenda items in order, the kind of session that would look in the record like nothing significant had happened. The kind of session that 300 years of structural change is mostly made of. I sat at my desk, my proper desk with the name plaque, Earth's delegate, first permanent seat, outer ring, standard position. The translation earpiece fit correctly now. Someone in the council's technical staff had calibrated it without being asked, which was a small thing that meant something I was still processing. I adjusted it anyway. Across the chamber on the interior tier, Vrethsa was reviewing his session notes. He looked up once, the way he had done on the night of the football match. Not pity, not assessment. That third thing I was still finding a name for. He nodded. I nodded back. The session opened. Agenda Item 1. 3 species status review requests, filed under the Commission's new independent review framework, originating from petitions originally submitted through the ORATH Relief and Petition Assistance Network. The clerk read the case numbers. I recognized all 3. I had been there when they were first filed, sitting on the floor of 3 different rooms in 3 different systems, notebook in hand, listening to people tell me about 60, 80, 90 years of waiting for someone to pay attention. The session would last 4 hours. 2 of the 3 items would be tabled for further review. 1 would move to the next stage of the commission process. 1 out of 3. I noted it, recorded it, filed it in the place where I kept things that were not done yet. After the session, I walked back to the network office, which still operated out of 3 rooms on the mid-level transit station. The petition queue was running 400 active cases. Ada was coordinating a filing training session for 2 drain administrative assistants who were learning the system so they could run it themselves. Simon was building a new translation layer for 3 additional species dialects. Owen was on a call with Vel's commission technical team. I sat at my desk. The child's drawing was still on the wall above the terminal. I had moved it from the old office when we expanded, held it carefully by the edges, tacked it back up in exactly the same position. Still could not tell what it was. Maybe that was fine. Maybe some things do not need to be identified. Maybe some things just need to be carried. I opened the filing queue. 400 cases. Each one a case number, a timestamp, a species, a grievance, a specific and particular account of something that had happened to real people over the course of years or decades, waiting in a queue for a 45-day response that the council was now, slowly, grudgingly, because it had no procedural alternative, actually providing. Not fast enough. Not thoroughly enough. Not nearly done. Right. I thought. Sure. Okay. I started working. They sanctioned us because we were unpredictable. They should have thought harder about what that meant.